From unfair weighing requirements to a super suspicious ranking system, these are the UFC rules that are in major need of a change. For starters, there's the whole situation regarding the UFC rankings. Let's be honest, neither fans nor I mind the UFC rankings. That's because they serve a purpose. They're specifically designed for one main reason, which is to ensure a level playing field and make it simpler for fans to understand which fighters are competing in each weight category. What's more is that ranking system also helps to prevent elite fighters from taking on less experienced or unknown opponents. This means we usually get matchups that make sense. Interestingly, the UFC didn't have rankings until 2013. The rankings consist of approximately 40 media members who share their opinions on the top fighters in each weight class. You see, the thing is, when the UFC rankings were first introduced, the voting was transparent. We could all see who the media members were that were voting. That's because all of their names were listed on the official website, but now their names have been removed, which makes me wonder, is the UFC intentionally trying to hide something from us? There's no doubt the ranking system has its benefits, but it's nowhere near perfect and there's definitely room for improvement. One of the main issues is that we don't know who the voters are, or even what criteria they use to make their decisions. Believe it or not, this can lead to some strange decisions being made, like the fact that it keeps certain famous fighters in the top 10 or 15 for longer than they deserve to be. The sole reason for this is so the UFC can profit from their continued relevance. Another issue is that the rankings don't work the same for all fighters. Sometimes a fighter who isn't even in the top 2 can get a title shot ahead of the #1 contender, which seems completely unfair. The ranking system is a useful tool to some extent, but it's not without its flaws and could definitely benefit from more transparency and consistency.
Top St. Preux trying to survive. I'm not sure the fence is his friend. Huge right hand there.
I think he's out of here right now.
He's going to get stopped. He's done. Oh, wow.
St. Preux gets it done.
Finished by Jamal Hill.
Much like this next rule, and that's the weigh-in system. Let's face it, the current weigh-in system used in the UFC is a major problem that simply can't be ignored. Fighters are often forced to cut significant amounts of weight just so they can compete in a certain weight class. This has led many to think this may just be the biggest issue facing MMA nowadays. It's not uncommon to see fighters shedding up to 30 pounds, and all this happened within the span of a couple of weeks that led up to their fight, which honestly is incredibly difficult and can be dangerous if not done properly. In fact, some fighters have even ended up in the hospital because of all this. While there have been some proposed changes to the weigh-in system, it's a complex issue that is difficult to fix. After all, every person's body is different, and what works for one fighter might not work for another.
Right into a triangle.
Reverses it. Triangle threat from Nickel.
He's also got the arm.
Let go of the cage. Stop. That's the tap. Inside a minute this time.
It's clear that something needs to be done to address this issue. I mean, the current system puts fighters' health at risk. Plus, it can lead to unfair advantages for those who are better at cutting weight. The UFC should explore all possible solutions. This will make sure that fighters are competing at a healthy weight and that the playing field is as level as possible. But that's not the only issue that needs the UFC's attention. There's also the judging system, which is in need of some serious change. One of the major concerns with the current rules in the UFC is the way fighters are judged. Many fighters have expressed frustration with the judging process, which can honestly feel arbitrary or inconsistent. It's clear that more transparency is needed. Plus, certain criteria should be set that judges follow to make the right calls. One potential solution is to alter or maybe even replace the 10-point must system. This already often leads to controversy and disagreement among judges. It's not even their only choice, because open scoring is another option that could be considered. I mean, it would at least give fighters insight into how each judge is scoring their fight. It just makes sense, right? Some have suggested that former MMA fighters could be brought on as judges, as they would have a better understanding of what to look for in a fight. Personally, I think that's a great idea too, but it's unlikely that there will be many fighters willing to take on this thankless job, especially due to all the potential for criticism and backlash they may receive.
He's turning, he's defending.
Hill postures up.
But Hill is still attacking.
Trying to put some power and put an exclamation point on the Knights. That'll do it! No!
Despite the challenges, I think it's high time the UFC took a good look at this rule, but I'm honestly just getting started with the absurd rules that the UFC has, because there's also the whole situation regarding the gloves that needs to be discussed. At first glance, eye pokes might not seem like a big deal, but in reality, they happen quite often during fights. This is due to the current gloves that are used, which have been criticized for their design. Because of this, straight-up eye gouges are a pretty common sight, and to address this problem, a proper rule set is really needed. You often see fighters stretch their hands to gauge their opponent's distance, but this has a big con. By doing this, they leave themselves vulnerable to eye pokes. Some fighters have even been accused of doing it on purpose to gain an advantage, and I honestly wouldn't be too surprised if they did, but unfortunately it's pretty tough to prove. Chuck Liddell, a former UFC fighter, has faced criticism for this in the past. They definitely need to adjust or modify the gloves in some way, because while eye pokes might only lead to mild discomfort in some cases, in others they can cause lasting damage to a fighter's eyes and affect their career. So it's incredibly important to take a good look at this. Much like this next rule, that's the scoring system currently in place at UFC. This rule is so controversial that it got UFC contender Rafael Fiziev publicly criticizing it. It's about how the rounds are scored. Fiziev got pretty upset about the Makhachev versus Volkanovski match, especially with how the fourth round played out. If you saw the match, you would have noticed that Makhachev held his opponent's back for most of the round. He even managed to lock him out in a body triangle that literally seemed to go on forever, attempting to go for a choke. But here's the problem. Even though he had managed to kill Volkanovski's movement, he didn't really do any damage. But the judges gave him the round because he was in control. Fiziev was not happy with this decision and thought the whole round was stalled because of Makhachev's hold. Giving him the round for stalling doesn't seem right. I think Fiziev has a valid point here, and I can understand why people are calling for a change to how rounds are scored. But there's one other rule in the UFC that needs to be altered, and that's the 12-6 elbow strike rule. Did you know that elbows to the head are allowed in UFC fights? But there's a twist as always. They need to be dealt in an arc. This basically means you can't attack your opponent with a vertical elbow straight at their head. That's known as the 12-6 elbow, and it's against the rules. The weirdest part is that this rule has been in place since the unified rules of MMA were founded. Apparently, it was because a member of New Jersey's athletic commission thought the move had been used in brick-breaking demonstrations, which made it too strong and damaging for fights. Some even believe that it's outright deadly, but most people think that as long as you're not using the elbow to thrust it into your opponent's spine, it should be alright. That's the reason many are calling for a change to the rule to allow the 12-6 elbow, especially since disqualifications due to this rule don't happen too often. So why even keep it in place at all? But those were all of the main UFC rules that need to be changed.